Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome. Today, man, you've seen him before on the show. Uh a supreme thinker, man, a historian. And we're about to have a dope conversation like we did the last time. My brother Abib, thank you for coming through.
Word up, man. Thank you for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to just be in communion with my people. So
No
thank you.
doubt. No doubt. Thank you, man. Thank you. I kind of wanted to start well, we already kind of, prepped for the build. So we'll start from the beginning and kind of walk people through where we're going. If you can, I want you to elaborate on Marcus Garvey's role in the origin of anti-imperialist movements in Jamaica.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's that Garvey inspired anti-imperialist movements not only in Jamaica but the entire Caribbean,
Hmm.
on the continent of Africa. Um, Colonialism was very young at the time, and I don't know if people realize that or not. By the time Garvey had came to New York, they was still pushing into Nigeria.
Mm.
Um, everything was in flux. The scramble for Africa was in full swing at that time. So naturally, of course, you have people before him. You have the Pan African Congress, if I'm not mistaken.
Hmm.
You have or the Pan African Conference. I always get those two mixed up. But you had people kind of stirring that pot after the
Hmm.
Battle of Adwa. But Marcus Garvey really, to me, had the largest reach. And so he was able to touch different regions in a way a lot of other thinkers weren't able to do. Um, yeah, I mean, and naturally he's from Jamaica, right? And so
Hmm.
naturally you have other people who share this belief or share this thought, and that spread like wildfire throughout the island.
No doubt, no doubt. And we know that around that time when Garvey was first coming on the scene, that a lot of uh, brothers from the Caribbean and brothers and sisters from the Caribbean were going to places like Panama, especially during when they picked back up the construction of the Panama Canal. Brothers and sisters was going to Costa Rica. Brothers and
Right.
sisters was going to Cuba. Um, you know, Mainstream at one point academia didn't really like to. They like to teach our history in a vacuum, but
Mm-hmm.
can you talk about a little, just how connected a lot of the communities were in the Caribbean at that time?
Well, I mean, I think this conversation is always interesting to me
Hmm.
because we as people of African descent, Black people, we've built networks
Hmm.
centuries ago when
Hmm.
we first got here,
Hmm.
and these networks have permeated throughout the years. Uh, and it took a long time to build, a long time to get things done, right? So it's always interesting to me when we kind of draw these imaginary lines between us by nation, and
Hmm.
we see ourselves in that way. Um, when that was never really, it wasn't really like that. When you went to Harlem, it was you had people that was Puerto Rican. You know what I'm saying? Like Schomburg. You had people that was Jamaican, right? Like
Hmm.
Marcus Garvey. You had people from Africa.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? People don't even know Kwame Nkrumah was in Harlem.
Right,
You know what
right.
I'm saying?
Facts.
So this idea that we was ever disconnected, I think,
Mm.
is the way that we should teach it
Hmm.
rather than the other way around.
Right, right. I like that. I like that a lot. Because a lot of times they like to, it's just the way that they frame things sometimes, and as if this movement here is separate from this movement there,
Right.
when that's not the case, and I think they do that to, uh, marginalize and delegitimize how powerful our movements are. You know what I mean?
I put it like this:
Mhm.
if you're an African American, proud African American, only see yourself as an African American, never even thought about Pan Africanism. If you yourself or any of your relatives have ever been Prince Hall Masons, congratulations, you are Pan Africanist.
Mm. Mm. Explain that a little bit. Explain that a little
I
bit.
mean,
Uh,
Prince Hall himself,
was from
right,
Africa.
was from Africa, was a Pan Africanist,
Hmm.
advocated for going back to Africa hundreds of years before Marcus Garvey was a twinkle in his father's eyes.
Hmm.
So If you call yourself a Prince Hall Mason, you are a Pan Africanist. I have family that are Prince Hall Masons going back generations. So,
Wow.
like I said, these connections that we've, that we are talking about, we've always had. It's never. These are not new things. So, this idea that this is somehow a new movement is the reason why we feel like we gotta, have conversations about how connected the Caribbean was. And we can definitely get granular and kind of get deep into that. But
Hmm.
like Prince Hall Masonry being an example of that. But on a macro, it's always been this way.
Right, right, right. And then, uh, I don't think a lot of people realize that Garvey was alive during the early formation of the Rastafari movement. And
Right.
although he's not the creator of the movement, um, would you say that Leonard Howell and the rest of, the uh, early Rastafarians were inspired by Marcus Garvey?
What I would say is absolutely. I mean, that they say it out of their mouth, right?
Mhm,
But I also, there's an interesting. How do I put this? Rastas have a very philosophical view of the world.
mhm,
Whenever they explain something, when you look at the verbiage that we use, is very intentional. So people always, are confused when we say things like Babylon. But Babylon is not a place; it's a concept. You
mhm.
know what I'm saying? So that's the reason why we call the police Babylon. You feel me? Because it
Right.
represents the oppressive nature, the oppressive force in the world. So
Mhm,
anything that's oppressive, Babylon is an easy metaphor for what that is, right? So with that in mind, a roster would tell you uh, there is no beginning in the sense. Like
mm,
I've always been a roster.
mhm,
I just didn't know it.
mhm,
You get what I'm saying?
mhm.
And so there's little concepts like that to the average person can be confusing because it's like, yo, when did roster begin? Why are you talking in riddles? But that's how we express and explain. Um, so, anyways, with that said, the reason I'm saying that is Marcus was a huge part of a bigger whole. You know,
Mhm, mhm,
he directly influenced people around him, people
mhm,
like Leonard Howell,
mhm,
who was a friend of his and who was also a member of the UNIA, which in turn led to the anti-imperialist push in the Caribbean and particularly in Jamaica. So to answer your question, absolutely, for sure. But you also had a very cultural, religious, I don't want to call it war, but it
mhm,
definitely was let's say people were standing on business. You know what I'm saying? Like
mhm,
you had the revival movement in the 1860s and 1860 and 1861,
mhm,
where people were kind of pushing more for their African, spiritual expression, and that turned into Pocomania and Zionism or
mm.
Zion.
Can you go into that some? Can you go in a little bit of that history some? Uh, I think that's a pretty interesting point of history in Jamaican history, and that was also
Absolutely,
around the time of the Morant Bay Rebellion as well with Paul Bogle, correct?
absolutely. So it was a lot of different things happening at that time, right?
Hmm.
Um, it was revolution pretty much everywhere in the 1800s, and especially in the Caribbean. But the reason why I was so poignant and the reason why I was so powerful rather in Jamaica is because you had a lot of once slavery ended in the 1830s, you had a lot of indentured servants fresh from Africa coming in. So it wasn't like I know in America it was a little bit different,
Hmm.
but over in the Caribbean, the indentured servitude continued on. That's why we have so many Indians.
Hmm.
So you also had a lot of people coming from the Congo,
Mm.
right? Who
Hmm.
also have hundreds, foundational years of Catholicism, Christianity in their realm, but also continuing to practice their own spiritual beliefs. So they're bringing Kumina, right, the full expression of it, because we had Congo people in Jamaica before then, obviously, but now they're coming as a community, if you will, and bringing their practices fresh that has been fostering in the Congo, fresh in Jamaica. So that's what Kumina is, right? So that's happening in the 1830s. Then you have the Maroons now, who are, commingling with the rest of the island because there's no more, there's no more, at the time it was peace times and the Maroons are moving and having kids and all that kind of stuff. So you also have that resurgence of that Maroon spiritual expression as well. And then you have a lot of missionaries from Savannah, funny enough,
Mm. Wow.
coming to Jamaica,
Hmm.
black men, African Americans, Baptists, right? Because remember, Sam Sharp, and if I'm not mistaken, Paul Bogle were Baptists,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
right? So you also have that energy, that Gullah, that hoodoo,
Mm-hmm.
that spiritual energy
Mm-hmm.
being brought to the island of Jamaica as well. So you have all of these things mixing. Oh, and I can't forget. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I can't forget the Nago, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can't forget the Nago, and that's my Yoruba people that was also coming into the island. And I have a lot of that heritage I have found out recently.
Dope.
So so you have all of these, forces kind of coalescing and that revival movement of Christianity sweeping into the islands as well, and that kind of erupted into what's known now as Pocomania
Mm-hmm.
and Zion, and this this is a MIL and like I said, Kumina. These are really the foundation of Rastafari. You know what I
Mm.
mean? Like at the root. That's
Mm-hmm.
really the foundation of not only Rastafari but also all of the cultural and spiritual expression on the island of Jamaica. You know, um, a lot of times when we talk about Hebrew Israelites, we kind of like to separate them from any kind of proximity to
Mm-hmm.
Jewishness. The same cannot be said in the Caribbean
Mm-hmm.
because you had Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews who not only were ship owners and merchants, right, but plantation owners, and a lot of them was commingling with the Africans,
Mm-hmm.
and
Right.
a lot of them was also coming from Brazil, Suriname, Curacao, uh, Sao Tome, you
Mm-hmm.
know, uh, all of these different places where the African and the Sephardic are now mixing. And that was also being brought to Jamaica. So when you hear a lot of this stuff about, um, the tribe of Judah and all this stuff like that,
Mm-hmm.
you have
Mm-hmm.
to understand that there's also a Jewish history on the island, a Jewish
Interesting.
African history
Mm-hmm.
on the island that is very unique. And I
Mm-hmm.
think when you look at the early days or the early years of even Hebrew Israelites, you'll notice a lot of them cats was Caribbean.
Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm
That's
saying?
very interesting. That's very interesting. Mm-hmm.
So I'm only explaining that not to validate it,
Mm-hmm.
but to explain the origins of it. When you
Mm-hmm.
have this commingling of the people, and we all know Judaism been in Africa for
Yeah.
thousands of years, right?
Right.
Um, so this is a conversation that's been happening. You know what
Mm-hmm.
I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You're dealing with the Catholic forces, the Portuguese in Spain. You're dealing with converso Jews who, because of the Inquisition. You're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with Protestant Dutch and
Mm-hmm.
British
Mm-hmm.
people, right? All of these people are commingling and selling, merchandise and selling Africans and,
Mm-hmm.
and owning plantations and da 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 da. So this is the soup, and then not even to even really bring in that extra part of it is you have the Indians now who are also
Mm-hmm.
being brought over to Jamaica, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people would think that Indians and Africans don't have anything in common, but a lot of those Africans were Muslim from West Africa,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them was coming from. We had Africans coming from Madagascar to Jamaica, who've already has proximity to the
Wow, from
Indian.
Madagascar as well?
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely. You can look it up if you look up Cujo and,
Mm-hmm.
and his maroons
Yeah.
on that side of the island.
Mm-hmm.
There was a contingent of people from Madagascar that was fighting for control of the group,
Mm-hmm.
and of course Cujo won, but that's not the
Yeah.
point. The point is that they were there.
Right.
So I mean, the Portuguese, that was worldwide trade. They was trying to get to India.
Right.
You know what I mean? And when slavery ended, they brought the Indians to
Right.
Jamaica. So there's always been a relationship to East Africa and the Indian Ocean um, that I think people don't realize. When you look at the crops that we
Mm-hmm.
were growing,
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, not to be too convoluted, the point I'm making is a lot of Indians also had that in common with the Africans, where they were coming from that Muslim background.
Let me ask you, let's stay right here for a second. All right. So in the British Crown abolished slavery in its colonies, Caribbean colonies in like 1838.
Mm-hmm.
Um, After that, and they began to, bring in indigent servants, the Indians from India, to help work. Oh, well, it's modern. It was still
Mm-hmm.
slavery, right?
It was
Like,
slavery.
so would you say that that was a similar situation, like with the Africans and the African farmers and the Indian farmers, as the after slavery here in America, we were still on the plantation and a sharecropping system. Would you say, because whenever I read about, about how that happened in Jamaica. I was like, man, that sounds similar, just like slavery by another name, the same way in America, once slavery was abolished, I mean, we still work the plantations. I mean, would you say that it was that there were, you see any similarities between the 2?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, that's absolutely what it was.
Hmm.
Those indentured service when they were brought over, that system of servitude was still there. We also had something called apprenticeship,
Hmm.
where when people were freed from slavery, they had to be an apprentice for like 4 years in the 1830s, and that was essentially slavery. But
Hmm.
the thing about slavery, though, the character of slavery, I think is important to describe
Hmm.
because there are different levels to it.
Hmm.
You could in Jamaica and in the Caribbean at large, there was a certain sense of autonomy that Black people had
Hmm.
that was different in certain regions. And it existed on the mainland in the Americas as well. When you think about places like Fort Mose and that kind of a thing. So
Hmm.
when you say this guy's a slave, but he works on a merchant ship, or he's the pilot of a merchant ship, or he works in the shop, and he knows how to read and write, and he speaks 5 languages. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
But he's a slave. You feel
Hmm.
me?
Hmm.
So it's kind of like that. It's like yes, there's levels of slavery even, and I think that's something that we don't talk about because I mean, you look at Indian people, the first thing you want to do is assume where they come from and their background, but in Jamaica, bro, it was like it was no better than the Africans really. It was
Hmm.
almost worse in some cases, um, for different reasons. I'm not gonna try to compare and contrast,
Yeah.
but it was definitely they wasn't treated good. So there's that assumption as well. And to some extent, there's a reason for that. You know what I mean? Like there definitely were racial tensions, but there's levels to slavery, and I think that's more important to kind of point out than the I guess the similarities of the systems because it definitely was, man. Indentured servitude was not easy.
Right.
It definitely was very similar to sharecropping, and it was brutal, man.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when Garvey was deported and went back to Jamaica, um, he began to actually, really not just influence, but get into local politics, right? And
Absolutely.
so, if you can, what was the People's Political Party?
So, Garvey was really, I mean, he was into politics, I would say, even before he got to Jamaica.
Hmm. Oh,
But
yeah, for
that,
sure. Hmm.
but the PPP was definitely his official foray into the arena, particularly in Jamaica because he had basically just got deported,
Hmm.
and so it's like now this is the arena that he can work in and still try to make moves and get certain things done. And he was already speaking about liberation and anti-imperialism and all of that stuff. So why not extend that back at home? That's
Hmm.
exactly what he did.
Hmm.
There's a misconception that he somehow just disappeared and died of a
Right.
broken heart, and that was it. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
But
Right.
nah, he came
Eh,
back to Jamaica with that same fervor, that same energy,
mhm.
and he really influenced a lot of the labor unions and the labor movements on the
Hmm.
island. Because if you pay attention, after all of this stuff going on with the UNIA, Marcus Garvey gets elected in Kingston. I don't know what his position was,
Hmm.
so I don't want to lie, but I definitely know he was elected in Kingston.
Hmm.
And after that, you start to see all of these labor revolts
Mm.
happening.
Mm.
Right now,
Hmm.
you have these new young leaders popping up. The Norman Manleys of the world and the Bustamanis of the world, and that kind of a thing. And that's when the labor movement started, and those revolts eventually led to political autonomy, and then
Hmm.
of course eventually independence,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so what grew out of that though was a national movement, a Jamaican movement, if you will, because
Hmm.
now it's not just the Africans, you also are talking about the Indians and all these other people on the
Hmm.
island. So there was a push to have a Jamaican identity,
Hmm.
um, but because Pan Africanism is the root, as you can see on the island, nobody was going to give up
Yeah.
mentioning or making sure that we're representing our African heritage. If you look at our flag, that's essentially the Ashanti flag. You know what I mean? The same
Mm.
color.
Mm.
A lot of the Ashanti flag predates the Jamaican flag, and that was intentionally done
Wow.
because we everyone knows that we have Ashanti heritage. So, anyways, I say all of that to say, Marcus Garvey definitely is the reason for the anti-imperialist movement, particularly in Jamaica, for sure, without a doubt. Like I don't think anybody can discount that.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. And I want to ask you this. So there are, a lot of white leftists, and when I say leftists, I mean socialists, Marxists, communists, who do not like Garvey because of Garvey's idea of nationhood, and a lot of white leftists only see they want to unite under class, but they dismiss anything that has to do with race as identity politics. But what's funny is I know, but but what's funny is but that's easy for them to say, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
they don't live our experience. But what's funny is, and I kind of want you to just, talk about what your thoughts is on that, is when Garvey went from whenever he was young, a young man went from Kingston to Costa Rica, and he began to work for the United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita Banana.
mm,
And when people, and I want people to visualize when I say like work at the United Fruit Company, this is a plantation.
absolutely.
And they're still there. And well, you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? That's but this is a plantation. But anyway, and so but many you know uh Caribbean brothers and sisters, were going to these different United Fruit Company plantations to work.
Hmm.
Garvey being one of them. When Garvey began keeping an eye and observing how uh, there were labor issues
Hmm.
um, with this, right?
Right,
Which
right, right.
obviously is, it's that these are what most socialists see as the foundation of
Mhm.
any type of movement for liberation, right? um
You know
but
you know
but,
what
but go ahead,
what's
but
crazy.
because you know where I'm going.
I see where you're going, and I love it because you're tapping into something that's very important. And there's when you get the stamp, and there's when you were actually doing the work.
Hmm.
And before there was a UNIA, Marcus was doing the work.
Hmm.
So if you see him in Costa Rica, you see him in these places starting these labor union movements,
Hmm.
and then you see him come to Jamaica, right? And this is very important that you pointed this out. You're doing because you're doing the math, right?
Hmm.
He comes to Jamaica, he starts a political party, he gets elected, he's you know what I'm saying? He's doing what he normally does, and then slowly but surely, these labor movements pop up. These labor revolts start happening, and you mean to tell me that has nothing to do with Garvey when this is literally the exact thing that he was when he was in
Right,
Central America? Like
right,
it doesn't make any sense. You
right,
know what I mean?
right,
So,
right.
but I ain't mean to cut you off.
No,
Continue.
no, that's what I wanted, and yeah, because I found like that is they they trip me out with that sometimes, just because it kind of goes to show that they don't really study our history and our movements, and they don't really understand what liberation, any type of liberation, uh, black liberation movements in like such as black nationalism and pan-africanism. A lot of I won't say all, but a lot of white leftists just dismiss them without understanding what they are. And throughout history we have great women who were more than just the wives of powerful men, such as Dr. Coretta Scott King, such as Dr. Betty Shabazz, such as Shirley Graham Du
Right.
Bois. In
Mhm.
this case, when Garvey died, and they began to, uh, as a concerted effort, the powers that be in Jamaica and in America, wanting to, silence any remnants of Garvey's movement after death, wanting all of his ideas to just go away in a fond mist. Amy Jakes Garvey took it upon herself to begin to compile his writings, Garvey's writings, use her own money and money that she borrowed after being turned down by so many different all the publishers she reached out to,
Right.
um, getting thoughts and opinions out, getting Garvey and Garveyism out. If you can, like, what are your in our circles? Obviously, this is not a thing, but when we look
Yeah.
back on history, what are your thoughts on the fact that history has not, um, in my opinion, history has not remembered Amy Jakes Garvey the way it should. Um, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I'll put it like this. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's a very cultural thing.
Mm,
In the
mm-hmm.
Western world, it is normal for them not to venerate the women in their societies.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying this to point the finger or nothing, but it's kind of just it's a fact. If you look at their history, they will tell you, you know what I mean, like
Mm-hmm.
that women are not allowed in these spaces for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say you don't find some of that in African societies or whatever. But the point I will make with that is in Jamaica, it's not weird for women to be venerated or be put in positions of power.
Mm-hmm.
All the way back to Queen Anne. She was
Right,
the
right.
queen, right? She was the queen mother of my ancestral village of
Mm-hmm.
Moortown, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
Nannytown, rather. So that it just goes to show like the way that we view, and she's not the only one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the Caribbean. If you talking about Haiti, if you talking about all of these different places, and even in America, right? So I think what you're seeing in is, and this is going back to us having our own networks and
Mm-hmm.
having our own sense of nationhood and who we are as a people, and the way that we connect and commune. I think what we're talking about really is assimilation. We have fully accepted that we have assimilated into their sense of society, and because of that, we say it's almost like when the slave talks to the master. It's like we sick, boss.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not that ain't got nothing to do with us.
Right, right,
You know what I
right,
mean?
right,
Because
right.
we're not in control of the empire right now. They are.
Mm-hmm.
They have control over the narrative. So
Mm-hmm.
of course they're gonna want to erase her influence because it helps them. When they came to Africa and they saw the market being run by the women, they said, no, 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 no. We can't have that. You know what I'm saying? We
Mm-hmm.
can't have them controlling the market and telling us what the price is. We're not dealing with them.
Mm-hmm.
We're only dealing with the men. You get what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the beginning of it.
Yeah. Right, right, right. Great breakdown. And so when and just to kind of add on for people who may not know some of that history is, yes, it is true that Amy Jakes Garvey used her own money and money that she borrowed to get her late husband's works out there. It is true that there were powerful entities in place that were doing everything they could to stop her and silence um, the teachings of Marcus Garvey.
Mm-hmm.
But just like capitalism goes, during the 60s, when um, during the height of the Black Power movement in America, thoughts and opinions once went from, I can't find anybody to publish this, to publishers beating down their door in order to do it, right? So it just kind of it just kind of goes to show, uh, like a lot of this history and these movements are so layered, and the way that um, the powers that be attempt to capitalize off of these movements once the leader of that movement dies is always something. In a way, like we've obviously seen it with Dr. King. In a way, they like how did it with Garvey. I feel like there's a concerted effort to do this, to rebrand Malcolm X. So it's just, just an interesting tidbit. But when it comes to Garvey, uh, there are, when we think of people who were influenced by Garvey, um, obviously uh, Malcolm's mother and father were going to, were UNIA members. They were going to, and they were, and Malcolm's mother wasn't just a UNIA member because of Malcolm's father. She was going to UNIA meetings with her uncle in Canada before she even met his father. His father was loud and outspoken about, Pan-Africanism and what
Right.
Garvey was teaching, which is, why he was, you know, uh, killed and firebombed the house and all of that kind of stuff. Um, I may, but anyway, just saying, and we also see that if Malcolm was the son of two Garveyites, then uh, I think it's safe to say that Garvey influenced Malcolm, right?
Right.
Um, we
Absolutely.
we had Carlos Cooks, and who was influenced by Garvey. But during this time that we just mentioned,
Hmm.
um, where the silencing of Garveyites and Garvey's teachings was in full effect, Rastafarians, in my opinion, were the ones who kept his name alive and teachings alive the most.
Hmm.
If you can, just speak on that a little bit.
Absolutely. I think this is an important distinction to make.
Mhm.
Um, I haven't really heard a lot of people speak to this, so I'm glad that you're giving me the opportunity to speak on it. I think a lot of times when you see the Rasta movement, what you're seeing is a branch of the UNIA in
Mm,
essence. You
hmm
know, it was
hmm
a very political. How do I put it? It was a very difficult time politically for the UNIA in particular because it was such a concerted effort to break it.
hmm
There were people that was, betraying each other, and you're seeing things branch off to different, you know what I mean? It was just chaos.
Right.
And so Leonard Howe, being a UNIA member himself, bringing a lot of this back with him to Jamaica and kind of speaking to the spiritual component, and really kind of what he was doing was building a mythos for the people. Um, and he was using other influences like Ethiopianism and a lot of the
hmm
Black Power pushing that was going on before him to also inspire the Rasta movement. And so a lot of times when people talk about the Rasta movement, because it was such an isolationist thing at first, when he created Pinnacle, and these are people, that's really pooling their resources and being successful at it, and that were fought against. But we kind of only focus on that one, and we don't really talk about the EWF, or the Ethiopian World Federation, because when you see that, you clearly see that these were not just crazy men with dreadlocks smoking ganja in the mountains of Jamaica. These people are politically active. They're doing studies with the different universities. People like Monomo Platos, if I'm saying his name correctly, who was actually Cuban, by the
hmm
way,
hmm
uh,
hmm
and he was a big influence to Bob Marley, for instance. So if you talk about Bob Marley, you have to talk about Manuel Plano, who is again Cuban, and is a
Wow.
prominent Rastafarian leader.
Wow.
Who he went to Ethiopia, met with Haile Selassie before Haile Selassie visited Jamaica. He was doing that, and he was working with one of the universities in Jamaica. I can't remember. I think it's the University of West Indies. But anyways, the point I'm making with that is when you look at the EWF, you look at Ethiopia when they had that war breakout with the Italians, and
hmm
Selassie sent the emissary to Harlem and Jamaica,
hmm
um, to build this thing and to,
hmm
to help build the Ethiopian World Federation. And Rastas was some of the earliest people to join that movement, right, and
hmm
push for the liberation and liberation of Ethiopia. At the time, it was a war, so that was the push. That was the whole thing. So, anyways, I say all of that to say, if when you look at the EWF and you look at Leonard Howard and the Rastas, and then you look at Garvey uh, in the 30s up until he died,
hmm
you clearly see that there was never a cutoff. There was never a
Yeah.
period where there was a lull, or you know what I mean.
hmm
Even the people in the labor unions, a lot of those people were Garveyites.
Right.
You get what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
So yeah.
And it's kind and like the fact that Garvey used to write about and say this Psalms often, princes shall come forth out of Egypt, Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God. And Ethiopia, meaning all of Africa, right? Is how Garvey, but just to see, you know, this idea and Rastafari Rastafarianism, there's not a difference. You know what I'm saying?
It's always been political, and I'm gonna
mhm,
explain to you why.
mhm,
Because if you got to remember, at the time, Garvey had already tried with Liberia. All of
mhm,
those prominent Liberian politicians were UNIA members. So Garvey was he was already deep in Liberian politics, more so than people give him credit for. When that didn't work and that backfired on him, right? Naturally, who else are we going to look to for inspiration, for liberation and independence in Africa? And naturally, you already have an Ethiopianism movement going on in the religious part of black nationalism, then you're going to also look to Ethiopia being the only independent nation outside of Liberia, right? But
mhm,
the independent monarchy, kingdom, whatever you want to call it, empire in Africa, naturally those guys are the leaders. They defeated the Italians. They're part of the UN or the League of Nations. So this is a very calculated political statement that's being made. Why would we, right? Because remember, in Jamaica, we're under the crown, not
mhm,
the president of the United States, the
mhm,
crown. So
mhm,
we're bowing to the monarchy of England.
mhm,
So intellectually, right? Why would we bow to these white people when we should be bowing to the African monarch that's still standing alone? All
mhm,
of the other African monarchs fell.
mhm.
Do you understand?
Yep.
So at the time in 1930, we're not talking about right now when everything is different and we can argue about the past and what was, oh man, why are we looking to
Yeah,
Selassie?
right then. I need people to understand the
Yeah,
context of the time. Right
yeah,
then,
right. Like,
Ethiopia being uh while the rest of Africa is colonized,
right,
Ethiopia is not. You know what I mean?
right.
And
Bingo,
the fact
bingo.
that how even when um Italy began to and well, who was it? So yeah, so it was Italy that was it Italy that or was it
You mean that
it
attacked
was
Ethiopia?
yeah.
Yeah, it was Italy.
And so that was a point of especially all throughout the Caribbean. That was a huge deal where people came together in the spirit of Pan-Africanism and would
Right,
have different religious ceremonies that were all about Ethiopia keeping their independence. And I wanted to just mention that because the context is important. Like you said, we're not
right,
talking about now or looking back on history. We're talking about before the internet,
right,
before people watching TV. Like
right,
we are like having a nation in Africa that has not been colonized. We see how important even symbolically that meant to the diaspora.
right. And not only symbolically, but also physically because of the fact that he was physically supporting liberation movement. When you got to look at his actions because people love to be like, oh, Selassie didn't think he was black and all this foolishness, but you got to look at his actions. Why would Selassie, a monarch in Ethiopia, right? If he supposedly wanted to be European or Arab or whatever people try to say, why would he visit Jamaica? Why would he? Why would he allow Rastas to visit him in his palace and then go visit the Rastas and give them a medal in
Mm,
Jamaica?
mm,
Why would he visit Haiti?
mm,
Why would he go to the Abyssinian church in Harlem?
mm.
Why would he do that?
He
Why
was
would he do it?
and he
You know
was
what I'm saying?
right. He was writing Marcus Garvey when he was in Harlem before he even um, uh, took power.
So this idea that Selassie was disconnected from black liberation movements is crazy. He's always been connected in that way. So when you look at people who are saying that we're loyal to the Ethiopian crown, we're loyal to the Ethiopian Christianity, we're loyal to the Ethiopian sense of whatever. When you see people, do that, you have to understand the context and why. What does that mean? What are they saying when they're saying that they're loyal to the emperor of
Hmm.
Ethiopia?
Hmm.
Because you also got to look at even in the Haitian Revolution, there was people saying that they were loyal to the king of the Congo, right? So this idea of venerating great people that are fighting on your behalf is a very African thing. We venerate as Rastas. not only do we venerate Haile Selassie, we venerate Nyabingi, who's also a liberation movement leader. People don't even, people say Nyabingi and don't even know what Nyabingi means.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying? And that's a woman, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
right? So liberation, boom. We venerate Nyabingi, we venerate Haile Selassie, we venerate Queen Nene as a Maroon,
Mm-hmm.
right? She's one of our leaders. We venerate her. We venerate Marcus Garvey. We call his name when we banging drums, excuse me, at Bingy night, right?
How many
So
reggae songs have been made about Marcus Garvey? You can't
you
even
feel me?
count them.
Right. So that's
Calypso,
the
you
thing.
can't even count them. You know what I'm
So
saying?
I think sometimes it's important. Context is important. Listening is also important.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding of history and regional context is also important.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I was talking about a lot of that other stuff earlier, to also understand the soup, the religious and spiritual soup that made uh, just an average Jamaican, not even talking about rosters, and how they speak about biblical things, and how they speak about the way that they express their spirituality, right? There's that synchronicity that's going on in Jamaica. And
Mm-hmm.
so even when we talk about, like I said, some of the parallels to uh, the Israelites in Egypt and that story, there's the heritage to that, but then there's also a metaphor to that as well. Sometimes these stories are just representing, you know, uh, concepts and ideas. And the same way that we'll talk about the Israelites, we'll talk about Shango,
Mm-hmm.
right? We'll talk about Anansi.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, you kind of have to get that context to really understand why Rastas speak the way that they do, and why
Yeah.
Rastas view things the way that they do. So it can be difficult to decipher that. And that's why I'm glad that I have the opportunity to speak to some of this stuff, because most Rastas is not going, we're gonna speak in rhythms. And
Yeah. Yeah.
we're gonna, you know what I mean? We're gonna
Yeah,
get
for
to the
sure.
the biblical metaphors and the
Yeah.
story of this person, because we're trying to get you to break away from um, singular thinking. And
Mm.
Rastas be arguing amongst themselves, not arguing,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
reasoning amongst themselves about
Mm-hmm.
ideas and thinking outside of the box. Because what we're dealing with is concepts,
Mm-hmm.
allegory, stories, the learning the lesson. It's a very African thing to do, but it's also
Absolutely.
it's a very Eastern mystic
Mm-hmm.
thing to do as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we forget about the African Sufis that were
Mm-hmm.
brought to Jamaica, right?
Mm.
We
Mm.
forget about the Hindu and the spiritual Indian Muslims that were brought to Jamaica. We forget about all of these very deep intellectual thinkers, even before the advent of Rastafari.
Mm-hmm.
We don't talk about the Sufi in the Maroon compound in the mountains, kicking knowledge. We
Right.
don't think about him.
Right.
We
Right.
don't think about him when we thinking about the way
We
that
don't.
Rastas express
We.
themselves.
You're right. You're right. That's a powerful sentiment. We were just speaking on Garvey's People's Political Party. If you can, do any of if you can explain who the what the two Jamaican political parties are now, and if any of those two political parties have any roots with the People's Political Party.
So I would argue that they all have roots
Mhm.
the PPP. That's what I would say. I mean, but on a less metaphorical sense, the JLP and the PNP are the two political parties in Jamaica. One normally is a little bit more democratic, socialism leaning, left, if you will. The other
which
one,
which one is that?
that's the PNP.
Hmm.
And that was the one that was headed by first Norman Manley and then Michael Manley.
Hmm.
The JLP, which is the political party. I hate to say that they're on the right, but it's a little different. They're a
Hmm.
little bit more, allied to the free market, if you will, allied to self reliance. Um, and it's kind of interesting because, again, you could look at the JLP and the PNP as like two sides of Garvey.
Mm.
You get what I
Mm.
mean?
Mm.
Because
Right.
because the JLP, you would look at them as being the complete opposite, but they venerate Garvey. They
Hmm.
were the ones that made him a national hero in Jamaica, right?
Hmm.
So saying that we should do for self, you know what I'm
Right.
saying, is a very Garvey-esque thing to say. Hold on one second.
Hmm.
Jalil, I'm in a meeting right now, okay? I'm gonna come in just a second. Sorry about that.
No, you good, brother.
But
Peace to the seeds, man. You know what I'm saying?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But go ahead.
But yeah, yeah, yeah. So anyways, but yeah, the JLP is the opposite party. But the thing about both of them is that they come from the same root because they actually used to be one and they split apart. So Bustamante, if I'm saying his name correctly, um, who broke apart from Norman Manley and created the JLP, uh, they're cousins, Norman Manley and Bustamante. So
Oh wow.
yeah, so there's that connection. Um, and I think that if we try to leave Garvey out of that conversation, we do ourselves a disservice. And they didn't leave Garvey out of the conversation because, again, once we got independence, Garvey was made a national hero. So that just goes to show you how they view Garvey.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Um, so yeah, both of those parties are the current parties in Jamaica, and they come from labor unions. They come from that whole labor movement, and they just had different ideas, man. You know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? And once outside forces kind of came into play, it just kind of exacerbated that issue even more. Um, and it kind of spiraled from there.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Who, if you can, who was Michael Manley, and what did he mean to the people of Jamaica?
So Michael Manley was the son of Norman Manley, who was the founder of the PNP, one of the leaders, the early leaders of the PNP. So Michael Manley, he was educated abroad, and he was just a young, like a young college kid, if you will, is the best way
Hmm.
to kind of look at him. But he took the PNP, to basically a leadership role in Jamaica when he won the election in '72 and then again in '76. So I mean, the '70s were pretty much the PNP era, if you will.
Hmm. So,
Yeah,
so, okay. It's, the reason I asked about Michael Manley is because in a lot of revolutionary circles, and I'm sure in the Caribbean, he's seen as somebody who is really, he was a larger than life figure. Did did he have any connections with Castro as well?
yeah. I mean, I think most people know that. He
Mhm.
he was a big supporter of Castro, but I want to be clear. But I also want to be careful too, because he would say himself that he supports some of the things Cuba does, but not all of the things. You know what I'm saying? That doesn't mean that they can't find synergy. But he was a tactician. He was a politician. But in actuality, the reality was, yeah, he was about that life. You know what I mean? The global South was definitely a thing back then, and these people were clicking up and trying to figure out ways uh, to they had just got their independence, and so in the Caribbean, a lot of places were still colonized. In Africa, a lot of places were still colonized. And the idea was, well, how do we support these movements? How do we get liberation for everybody?
Hmm.
So this was a very fresh thing. It wasn't like now where Jamaica is 60 years in the game. So they were thinking about how do we free everybody because it just makes us stronger.
Can
Because
you
we literally
expound on a
got
little? Can you expound on that idea a little bit? Because I think that's a powerful one. Like whenever we talk about the connection between people like Manley and Castro, and then we also look at Castro supporting different efforts in Africa. Like these movements that were going on, like you said, were not just about, hey, let me free the place that I'm in now. No, it was like let's let's free all oppressed people.
what's crazy. So okay, Cuba. How do I put this? Cuba was definitely responsible for a lot of that push.
Hmm.
Also have to be clear. It wasn't when we say, and this is me coming to my realization. This is not even me trying to correct or whatever. This is me looking at the history and understanding it, getting the history from the people around me. Da, da, da. And I was like, okay, so Cuba absolutely was at the forefront of fighting for liberation in Africa. Absolutely. Um, However, it's more accurate to me to say Cuba and their Caribbean allies.
Hmm.
You get what I mean? I
Hmm.
think that to me is more accurate to say.
Hmm.
Cuba and its Caribbean allies were
Hmm.
actively fighting in Africa and supporting liberation movements. To me, that's more accurate because naturally, if you're going to Africa, you're going to send the more, the African looking people in Cuba,
Yeah.
which it's a lot of those people, but they could have easily sent. those other guys. And one of the reasons they didn't want to do that is because they didn't want people to know that there were Cubans in Africa. You know, they didn't want
Mm.
to make it. They didn't want to make it at first, like especially when they were in
Yeah.
the Congo. They didn't want
It,
to make it that
it's funny, like, isn't that just that's the thing about being African, man? You could whatever, like,
blend
like,
in,
yeah, exactly, like,
blend
what,
in. And so a lot of times,
whether
what
you in
people don't
America,
realize.
Jamaica, or Nigeria, man. But go ahead.
No, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. And so there was already a contingent of Jamaicans going back to Africa anyway for missionary work. They was moving back to Ethiopia, going to Ghana. Da, da, da. Jamaicans were just moving around.
Mhm.
Reggae artists that was traveling and performing in Africa, performing in the UK.
Mhm.
So when it comes to Africa now, something that was brought to my attention, actually I didn't even know, was you had the Brigadista program, which was not just in with Jamaicans but other Caribbean islands. A lot of these people were being brought to Jamaica. I mean, excuse me, brought to Cuba and trained in guerrilla
Wow.
warfare,
Wow.
trained in
Mhm.
not just not just for that reason. Also, they were
Yeah.
being they was trained medically. They were being trained as builders and da da da. Like there was a lot of practical stuff going on with that program. But you had people that actually was sent to Africa
Mhm.
with the Cubans, which I didn't even realize. But it makes sense. Why would you train these people and just send them back to Jamaica? Why wouldn't you take on a few people? Because they also brought back a lot of Congolese to Cuba. A lot of
Wow.
people don't know that.
Wow.
So, anyways, not to harp on that, but the point
Mhm.
I'm bringing that up is it gets complicated because the Cold War was going on. And
Mhm.
so, although I do applaud a lot of the efforts that was going on naturally as a Pan Africanist, right? It's also not as cut and dry because you
Mhm.
also had the Soviets
Mhm.
that were involved in that conversation.
Oh yeah,
And
absolutely.
although Cuba was doing things on its own in certain instances, that hand was always there. And so we don't manufacture weapons in Jamaica,
Right.
just the
Right.
fact. So all those weapons that was flooding the streets, it was not only because of the CIA, it was also because of Cuban intelligence and KGB and all of that. You know what I mean? So it was a
Mhm.
war going on. So the rosters now, and when I say the rosters, it's not like they were a separate entity. A
Mhm.
lot of these people were friends, grew up together. Some gunmen, you know what I'm saying, or mercenaries, if you will, um, consider themselves as rosters but don't have dreadlocks. So it's a very fluid thing
Mhm.
when I say us roster. But a
Mhm.
lot of rosters was against the shitstem, as they would call it. They didn't want to get into the Cold War. They didn't want the eagle or the bear. They wanted the lion. You
Hmm.
know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So to them it was like, we're not gonna fight in this war. We're gonna more so repatriate back to Africa and and get under the leadership of that so we can liberate our people. Again, that's the political stance that Rastas was taking.
Mhm.
But you also had a lot of people, like I said, who consider themselves Rastas on both sides that was
Mhm.
caught up in that the political violence that was going on at the time.
Well, that's what kind of wanted to go next. So if you can, obviously without giving too much for TV, but how did the differences in political parties, like how did that create the civil war that happened in Jamaica? Because a lot of people might not even be aware that that this is even an event. You know what I mean? So if you can go into some of that.
Well, we got to be clear
Hmm.
because a lot of people's not going to like what I'm about to say.
Hmm.
Jamaica, what you see in Jamaica is a warrior culture, a warlord warrior culture. Literally, right? We talk about Taki's rebellion.
Mm.
Taki was a warlord. Specific, you know what I'm saying? And when I say
Hmm.
warlord, I mean, yeah, I want to give him his veneration as an actual king,
Hmm.
but he was also a warlord from Ghana. This man was about that. He was about that life, and
Hmm.
I'm saying that because everybody that we talk about that is our national heroes were people that
Cujo,
fought.
Nanny, Paul Bogle. It was people that
Right?
fought.
People that fought, right? So you
Hmm.
see the people we choose to pick and venerate, and there's a reason for that because that history. Every 5 years in Jamaica, there was a slave revolt.
Mm. Mm.
You get what I mean? You
Hmm.
have different maroon leaders who all the time didn't agree with each other. You know what I'm saying? You had wars that was being fought, like the Second Maroon War, which some maroon factions were not supportive of, and some were. Right?
Hmm.
You had even when you had the issues in like Sam Sharp, Paul Bogle, you had the Maroons, and then you had the uprising, and then you had different factions.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that faction or that tribalistic thought predates the advent of that mini civil war in the 70s. So I think that's important to note first,
Okay.
because we kind of almost like forget about that history when we start talking about the violence,
Hmm.
as if it is a unique period in Jamaica's history. It's not.
Right, 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 right. It just had I understand what you're saying. It was
Yeah,
just
a lot of monarchies, a lot of them
hmm
were brought to Jamaica. A lot of royal people and warriors,
hmm
soldiers, all of these wars that were going on in Ghana, people wars of succession, and people trying to take the throne, and then they get taken. Where do you think they sent them? To
right,
Jamaica.
right, right, right,
that's
right.
why that's why Taki ended up in Jamaica. Queen Annie, right? Who's they say the Ashanti say she's from the Ayoko clan, that she's
Hmm.
Ashanti royalty, right? And her brothers, right?
Hmm.
They got sent to Jamaica. All of these different people got sent to Jamaica, and I'm saying that to make a point. Then you
Hmm.
have the warriors now
Hmm.
sent to Jamaica, right? Naturally, you got the planters and the agriculturalists, but you also have scholars that were taken to Jamaica. There's manuscripts written in patois, written in Ajami in
Right,
Jamaica.
right,
You see what I'm saying?
right.
You have all these different levels, but the point I'm making with that is that warrior culture, that Don culture, that chief, right? You have a colonel, right, of Moortown. We have leaders. Marcus Garvey was a Don.
Hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Hmm.
The biggest Don. So you can't move like Marcus if you don't have the people around. Let's just
Yeah.
keep it real.
Yeah.
This is what it
Yeah.
is. Malcolm X. I mean, Martin Luther King had some steppers around him.
Right.
You know. So I'm saying that again to go back to Jamaica to kind of bring it back. That whole island, that's kind of that. That's kind of the culture. And so you put some money in a person's hand, give them a little bit of influence, you give them a gun, and you give them something to fight for. You're gonna fight for it. Especially when you talk about life or death. You're talking about whether or not this garrison or parish or group of people is going to get food to eat or going to get jobs versus the next man. You see what
Hmm.
I'm saying? So that's how it exacerbated the issue. Once contracts started getting signed and people started wanting to get in a piece of the pie, and people start getting in positions of power, and the United States start getting in people's ear, and the KGB starts getting into people's ear, and you got the revolutionaries, and you got the Rastas, and you have this and that. That was a powder keg waiting to blow up.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. Now, one thing that I mean, we talk about steppers, and we talking about like really being about that life. If you can talk about the two Bob Marley concerts and his influence and what he trying to bring two sides of Jamaica that are in a civil war. Bob, not just the entertainer, he's striving to bring them together. And also, him being shot. If you can, you know, shed some light on that, because I think, that's important for people to know if people don't already know, because, you know, at one point, as we see with the movie,
Mhm.
that's coming out about Bob Marley, I have a really strong feeling that it's going to be all cap. I'm sorry, man. Like, it's probably going to look good aesthetically, but like what we're talking about here and who
Yeah.
Bob Marley was is not going to be addressed. You know what I'm saying? And
Mm.
so, there was a Bob Marley, in my opinion, went through a a posthumous type of reinvention, the same way Martin Luther King did and Muhammad Ali did. White folks did not like Martin Luther King. They did not like Muhammad Ali, and they did not like no Bob Marley. Right here, I'm talking about as far as here in the States. But
Right.
after they've died, they've changed their politics, made them all, you know, um, these somewhat passive figures that's all love. Don't get me wrong, Bob Marley taught and preached love, but he was willing to go in the trenches to make this happen, which is in the middle of a civil war. Is like, you know what I'm saying? You got to be
What
one of those
people
dudes.
what people don't realize about Bob, I'm gonna say two things. I'm gonna say
Hmm.
one thing about Bob, and I'm gonna address what you just said about how his
Hmm.
image got changed.
Hmm.
Bob is Bob didn't go to the trenches. He didn't come out the hill and go down to the hill into the trenches to meet with the people. Bob is literally from Trenchtown. You see what I'm
Right,
saying?
right, right, right. Let's go, let's go.
You
Right, right.
feel me? So a lot of those people he grew up with on both sides, they were his
Hmm.
friends. They would come around and they would kick it with him, and his house was like a neutral zone.
Mm,
So he was literally trying to bring peace between the two sides. But it wasn't just him. There was plenty of other people that was also trying to do the same thing.
hmm.
And so just like with any political games, people get caught up. And one thing this is what I would say about the story of Jamaica. This is something I realized. I was talking to my father about this. When I look back on the story, I realized that everybody who tried to do the right thing or did something with a conscience, they
Hmm.
paid for it.
Mm, mm,
It's something that I noticed
hmm.
because that's all Bob was trying to do
Hmm.
naturally. You know what I mean? He's getting influence now. He's getting some money now, but he's still amongst the people. He's still himself amongst the people. So naturally, he's going to want to bring peace to that. Why would you want to see your friends be killed? You know what
Yeah.
I'm saying?
Hmm. Hmm.
If over foolishness and politics and
Right.
things that you think is stupid. He was very politically aware. They never show the and going kind of segueing into the imagery branding. They never go to his interviews where he's actually talking about the politics of Africa. They want to show him when he's smoked out. And there's nothing wrong with that for me because I love it. I love him being smoked. I love being smoked out and giving his view on the world because they couldn't understand his philosophy, his thought process.
Hmm.
They wanted him to look like a drug addict or look like this fool from Jamaica or whatever. So they never showed an interview where he's talking about the politics of Ethiopia, for instance. He was very well aware of what was going on with the Derg in Ethiopia, and you start talking about socialism versus capitalism. One of the reasons why you don't really hear a lot of Rastas pushing that type of stuff. You might see some, is because at that time you had the Derg who was backed by the socialist forces, was backed by the Russians.
Mm,
You
hmm.
see what I'm saying? And
Hmm.
then you had who took down Selassie, the monarchy, right? And
Hmm.
then you have the capitalists on the other side. So it's like you kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Why would I ally myself with the people that just took down Haile Selassie?
Right.
Doesn't make sense.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So that's kind of that's another perspective that I think is important to point out. And Bob spoke about this specifically in the interview. He spoke about Zimbabwe. He spoke about all of this stuff.
Hmm.
But they don't want to talk. They never show those interviews about. They only show the ones where he's talking about his philosophy, love, and all that stuff, which is cool because that's also a part of it. And segueing into that, the reason that's done is for two reasons. One, capitalism, and two, white people also have a liberation movement. They want to liberate themselves from guilt.
Hmm.
And so whenever they have someone that preaches that doctrine of love and forgiveness and all of that, whatever, they use that as an opportunity to cleanse themselves without our permission.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
see what I'm saying?
Talking that talk, man.
But that's basically what they do. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, well, he said it's cool, so and it liberates them. It makes them feel good. They can now be a part of this movement because a lot of these white people that like the Rasta culture, they
It's
like
just
it
for the
because
trees, just for the herb, man.
it feels good
Hmm.
because it does feel good.
Hmm.
And I think that's actually something I think we should promote more to
Mm.
say, hey, look how good this feels to be in communion with your people. Look how
Mm.
good this feels to venerate your ancestors and to be at bingy night and you know what I'm saying, and to
Hmm.
really be amongst your folk and love on each other.
Hmm.
It feels so good
Hmm.
and so human. It gets to that
Mm.
thing that's in your soul that
Hmm.
goes deeper than just your ethnicity, that even these white folks want to be a part of that.
Right.
And I think that's important to point out
Hmm.
because it's a beautiful, beautiful culture. And
Oh,
I think
absolutely.
loving yourself, regardless if you're a Rasta, you're a 5%er, whoever, loving yourself is something that I think that we should all aspire to do. And
Hmm.
instead of being angry at these white people, you should be angry at yourself for not loving yourself enough to embrace it before they do.
Mm. 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 Before, still, if you can talk, tell me about the with Bob and like I guess some of the what happened at the concert. What were some of the repercussions of him even trying to bring these two factions together?
Uh,
We don't have to get into all the
yeah, yeah,
specifics.
I know,
Yeah,
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 I
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
don't want
yeah.
to get too, I don't want to get too deep with it, but
Hmm.
let's say, it was very similar to 1992
Mm,
and 93.
mm,
And if you know what I'm referring to, there was also a peace movement in LA with
mhm,
the gangs.
mhm,
And you can easily get into the politics of that as well, but
mhm.
without going into the politics, shit just kind of unraveled.
Yeah.
Let's just say that, you
Okay.
know. And so
Mm,
his first attempt, he got shot. His second attempt, it was a lot more successful
mhm,
in symbolism for
mhm,
sure. But shortly after, it definitely deteriorated. Um, right up until the 1980s election, which was one of the bloodiest years in Jamaica. So
mm.
yeah, without going into too much details,
Yeah. Yeah. I
it,
got you. I
it,
got you.
it definitely power in Jamaica switched hands, and a lot of things were happening at that time, particularly the Cold War.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, we getting into the early '80s and the
Yeah.
'80s and what
Well,
that entails.
Well,
And without
with that said, if you can, and again, no details, nothing specific, no details. But
um,
didn't the Civil War in Jamaica spill over to places like Florida and New York?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, and I think that's a good context to put on it, and because a lot of times when we talk about that era, we talk about it in terms of like crime
Mm-hmm.
and drugs and there's a lot of focus on that without understanding what was going on politically. So to your point, yes, that civil war absolutely spread to other places once a lot of Jamaicans were making their way to different places, and some people were fleeing
Mm-hmm.
for different reasons, and some people were naturally just wanted to go to greener pastures and see what was available.
Mm-hmm.
But as that happened, they brought with them their political leanings. They brought
Mm-hmm.
it with them,
Yeah.
straight up,
Yeah.
and that turned into so many different things. When you're participating in capitalism, let's just say that you're participating in trade and mercantile activity. A lot of things are going to happen, to chase the dollar,
Mm-hmm.
uh, especially when that dollar is going back into, different people's hands and funding different things.
Right.
So there was a motivation for the money, even in the movements of liberation. And
Mm-hmm.
almost sometimes, especially in the movements of liberation, a lot of people don't want to make that connection and talk about that, but it's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? It's
Mm-hmm.
just a fact. Both sides, right? So I'll explain it like that.
Right.
So to your point, yes, it
Mm-hmm.
definitely spilled over into different places, but naturally so. Some of these people were responsible for a lot of what was happening in Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
So I almost think it's poetic that it did spread to the mainland for people to kind of have to feel the effects of a natural. I mean, what they were responsible for.
Right.
Um, that might be a controversial opinion, but it's just a fact.
Yeah. No doubt. Brother Abib, man, this was a powerful bill, man. I appreciate you for coming through and shedding some light on what I think is some powerful history. And I want the people to understand you don't have to be Jamaican to take pride in this history because if you're an African person, this is your history as well. And
Right.
so, again, I thank you for coming through. For anybody that wants to find you on socials, let them know how they can find you.
Absolutely. First of all, let me also shout out my company,
Mhm.
Love. You can find us at We Spread Love with an X, so it's LXVE.
The
Uh,
link will be in the description.
Absolutely, man. My business partner, my brother Alfred Nomad, he just came back from Ghana, so we got some dope shit going on over there real soon. So I will be in the Caribbean real soon too. But you can find me at ICreateArt.atl on IG. Abib Rodney on Facebook. But if you want to find me easily, just type in Abib Jahleel and you'll definitely find me for sure.
Man, again, I definitely appreciate you. This is the second time on. We gotta, uh, you know, as a brother, you already know offline. We already locked in, but I appreciate you for coming on. And every time you come on, man, it's some powerful information. So I look forward to having you on again, brother.
Absolutely, man. Likewise, man. I'm always honored to be here, brother. So for sure. Until the next time, brother.
No doubt, no doubt. You be easy. Have a great weekend, fam.
All right.
Peace.